Chapter 470, Horia 5. Those flames. There was no way that Kamash wouldn't be able to recognize them. Those were flames of pure mana. Unlike Vermouth's flames, which had been a brilliant, stainless white, these flames were pitch black. However, something like color wasn't all that important when it came to things like this. Those flames were so pure in nature that Kamash couldn't help but think of Vermouth. Though at the same time, strangely enough, Kamash was also reminded of Hamel. While these flames were pure, there was also something passionate about them that had been lacking in Vermouth's flames. Kamash remembered both Vermouth's decisive and controlled slashing and how, in contrast, Hamel would slash away wildly like a madman. His cloudy head felt filled to the brim with these memories and emotions. His limp body obediently began to move in response to his heightened emotions. Kamash started to run while roaring, "Aia!" It was as if Vermouth and Hamel, both of them, were currently flying towards him. It didn't matter why they were here. It didn't matter that the man emitting those flames was neither Vermouth nor Hamel. The only thing that was important to Kamash right now was that this man had made him think of his enemies. In that case, there was only one thing for Kamash to do. Kamash's upper body leaned backward. His back got so close to the ground that it was as if he was about to lie down. Scrunch. His huge hand dug into the desert and scooped up a handful of sand. Killed. Crunch. His fingers clenched tightly around the sand. The incredible force of his grip solidly compressed the sand into a single lump. He then filled the lump that he had created to the brim with his dark power. Kamash had no need for weapons. Even when he was alive, Kamash was more accustomed to and comfortable with swinging his fists and feet around than wielding a weapon. That was also true for his stone throwing. The act felt both familiar and comfortable to him. Grab a handful of dirt, turn it into a stone and then throw it. With only this simple and primitive attack, Kamash had become the king of the giants. The stone was sent flying towards Eugene. Though could this really be called a stone? Although it had been made by squeezing a handful of sand, it could no longer be considered just a clump of loose sand. In fact, it didn't really matter what to classify the projectile as. Eugene just didn't want to get hit by it. He wouldn't die if it hit him, but it would be extremely painful. That said, I can't just dodge it, Eugene calmly assessed. If it continued on its current course, it might end up hitting Rymira, who was flying up behind him. Or perhaps it would swat some of the flying squadrons trailing even further behind, and it could also cause a disaster if it fell to the ground. Whatever the result might be, Eugene couldn't allow it to happen. So he didn't want to let it hit him, but he also couldn't dodge it. What a familiar situation, Eugene nodded thoughtfully. Then he would just have to destroy it. Throwing his cloak open, Eugene pulled out the holy sword. His black flames engulfed the blade of the holy sword. The sword's brilliant light then melded with the flames. Crackergow. The flames surrounding Eugene expanded explosively. The feathers of prominence, which were trailing behind Eugene like a comet's tail, also responded to Eugene's movements. Pong. Eugene split apart the stone that Kamash had thrown at him with a single slash. The dark power contained within the stone couldn't overcome the mix of flames and divine power, so it was forcefully dissipated. The stone that was split into two pieces then proceeded to disintegrate without leaving even a single pebble behind. Less than a second had passed since the stone had first been thrown. Light flashed in Eugene's eyes as a feather that he had sent flying forward during the moment of his slash was caught in the focus of Eugene's vision. Crackle. The space between Eugene and the feather was connected by a line of flames. For Kamash, the stone he had thrown had disappeared. Then his enemy had somehow appeared right in front of him. How could his foe have done this? But such a question wasn't of great importance to Kamash. "You dare," the giant howled. Kamash was still caught in his fit of rage. The hand that had just thrown the stone rose up. The enormous open hand swatted at the sky as if Kamash was trying to catch a flying pest. Boom. The sky shook violently. It felt as if the sky was about to collapse. Kamash's hand had suddenly stopped moving in midair. It had gotten caught on something. To Kamash, it felt like he had struck a wall that was impossible to break through. Such a feeling was unfamiliar to Kamash. Soon, Kamash realized what had blocked his hand from advancing any further. A tiny human who looked no different than an insect when put next to Kamash was blocking the palm of the giant's hand. So Kamash used even more strength to try and push his arm and hand forward. The arms currently attached to Kamash's torso were different from the ones that had gotten cut off when he was alive, but something like that didn't really bother Kamash. The current Kamash wasn't aware enough to feel any discomfort from having strange, new limbs, and far from being a problem, his new limbs actually performed better than the ones he had when he was alive. How hideous, Eugene thought as he held back the huge palm with the holy sword. The rough and tough leather of the giant's palm couldn't be cut even with the holy sword. To Eugene, the limbs currently attached to Kamash felt like they were several completely different body parts that had been reshaped together to look like limbs. Eugene didn't know where the parts to make these limbs had been ripped from, nor could he tell just how many pieces had been mixed together to make them. But wasn't Kamash actually stronger than he had been when he was alive? It really did seem that way. Eugene didn't think Kamash could have exerted such strength 300 years ago. In that case, just how strong was the giant? Eugene didn't know for sure, but he could at least be certain of this much. The deceased Kamash had become much stronger after being raised as an undead than when he was alive. Though not as much as I have, Eugene thought confidently. 300 years ago, Hamel was still a young man when he and Vermouth had worked together to block Kamash's advance. Frankly speaking, Hamel hadn't just been young. He was in many ways still immature. It had only been a few years since Hamel had first crossed over to the Devildom. This was even before they defeated their first Demon King. After killing Kamash, they had gone on to experience so many fierce battles that they had lost count. They slayed the Demon King of Carnage, the Demon King of Cruelty, and the Demon King of Fury. Then Hamel died, and was reincarnated as Eugene Lionheart. Eugene could feel vibrations in the air. Although nothing had actually happened yet, the divinity stored within Eugene glowed and communicated an intuitive hunch that was no different from true precognition. For a moment, Eugene's golden eyes shone with a slightly brighter light. The giant's thick fingers fell onto Eugene's head. In a split second, Kamash had clenched his entire fist around Eugene. And as if that wasn't enough, Kamash also wrapped his other hand around the fist. Whether it was crushing Eugene in his grip or hammering him down into the ground, there were many things that Kamash could have done from here, but none of them would have succeeded. Kamash's fingers were stopped before they could completely close. The moment he tried to put even more strength into his grip, Kamash was unconsciously forced to open his fist back up. Swish 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 swish. The black flames flickering around Eugene exploded into hundreds of different slashes. Kamash's palm was torn to pieces. And because he was a little slow to open up his fist, 2 whole fingers had been completely sliced off. But since his body was already dead, Kamash didn't feel any pain from this. However, an eerie feeling that was somewhat different from the sensation of pain was spreading from his wounds. Kamash couldn't comprehend what this feeling was. In fact, it was terror. But because Amelia had surgically excised so much of his mind, Kamash's body didn't tremble or hesitate due to his fear. Instead, his fear further fueled his rage. Kamash let out a loud roar and swung his fist at Eugene. But for such an obvious punch, there was no need for Eugene to even use a spatial leap to avoid it. Eugene accelerated forward, shedding the feathers of prominence behind him like the tail of a comet. From the perspective of the overwhelmingly larger Kamash, Eugene, who was flying around leaving a trail of light, looked like a pitch-black firefly. A firefly? Kamash scowled. That was only in terms of looks. This definitely wasn't some harmless firefly. With Kamash's giant field of view, he was able to take in Eugene's every movement. However, he still couldn't actually see Eugene. Even though Eugene hadn't left the giant's scope of vision, Kamash just couldn't follow his movements. Eugene would disappear in an instant, looking like his light had flickered off, and then he would reappear in a completely different location. Kamash tried to grab Eugene with another swing of his fist. But before his fist could even reach the intended impact point, Eugene turned into a streak of black light that flashed past Kamash's arm. His streak of light barely touched Kamash, but with only that, it still left the giant's arm in tatters. Viscous blood poured down from the wounds like a waterfall. With the holy sword, Eugene sliced his way up Kamash's thick forearms and reached all the way to the giant's shoulders. A neck that was as wide and tall as a castle wall could be seen right in front of him. Would he be able to slice through it with a single blow? Eugene asked himself as he gripped the holy sword with both hands. Black flames split apart the sky as Eugene swung his sword. However, Kamash's neck wasn't caught in the slash. Kamash dodged the slash by leaning over in a manner that seemed unbelievably flexible for someone with such a large body. Kamash's movement was just unnatural. At this thought, Eugene unconsciously let out a snort. After all, his enemy was a corpse. Kamash's movement didn't rely on things like bones, muscles, or nerves. The giant was only able to move through the use of dark power. So that's the case. Kamash also realized this fact. He now understood just how different this dead body was from the body he had when he was alive, with how it was incapable of feeling pain and the fact that he could now perform movements that were formerly physically impossible. Although some of Kamash's memories and emotions had been removed, his fighting spirit and honed battle instincts still remained. Ruhr. A seemingly endless amount of dark power enveloped Kamash's entire body. His ragged forearm was immediately glued back together through the use of dark power. So how was he supposed to fight with this brand new body and immense dark power? There was no need for Kamash to even spare a thought to answer such a question. Kamash, the chieftain of the giants and a child of fury, immediately understood how he was truly meant to be fighting. Kamash wasn't the only enemy in this desert. A three-headed wolf with long snake-like necks leaped over Kamash's body. It was one of the demonic beasts that had previously been sealed in the skies above Ravesta. Stretching out its necks, the wolf tried to devour Eugene. Gah! Kamash let out a rage-filled roar as he reached out his hand. The giant snatched one of the demonic beast's legs in mid-leap and then slammed it down into the ground. Boom! A crater was dug into the desert as sand was sent flying upwards. He may have already flattened the demonic beast, but that wasn't enough to cool Kamash's rage. Kamash raised his foot and stamped down on the demonic beast while roaring in a loud voice for everyone to hear, "This is my battle." It was only after crushing all three heads of the huge demonic beast beneath his feet did Kamash raise both arms to face Eugene in a battle stance. Ha! Eugene let out a huff of laughter at this sight. Eugene looked into Kamash's eyes and read the expression on the giant's face. Was he seeing the spirit of a warrior, a sense of honor and a respect for their battle? Oh, it was different. Eugene could see the difference between someone like Ivatar and Molin, and what Kamash had meant by those words. The reason Kamash had said those words and killed the demonic beast by trampling it beneath his foot was simple and clear, making it easy even for Eugene to understand the giant. It was all for revenge. Since Eugene was the one who had killed him, Kamash believed that he personally had to kill Eugene. Such feelings just made it easier for Eugene to deal with Kamash. Thanks to Kamash's behavior and the words he had roared, the countercharge being led from the Centipede Mountains had come to a screeching halt. "I'll kill you," Kamash growled. Boom! Kamash's foot stomped on the ground once more. Blood spurted out of the demonic beast that had already been trampled to death, and the thick cloud of sand that had been raised was filled with the scent of blood. When Kamash swung his arm, the wind that this move created blew away the cloud of sand. A massive amount of dark power accompanied the movements of Kamash's arm, battering its way through the air. Eugene's sight was instantly filled with a thick darkness that left no room for him to escape. In response, the light and flames covering the blade of the holy sword grew longer. The two lights swirled around each other and then became one. The moment Kamash's fist and dark power were about to make contact, Eugene held the holy sword up with both hands. Then he covered it in the layers of the empty sword. Eugene didn't use ignition. He didn't even see the need to max out the number of stacks. While twisting his upper body, he swung the empty sword with both hands, though it looked more like he was swinging a club than a sword. The power of Eugene's blow was terrible. The wave of dark power that had covered everything in front of him was instantly erased. Kamash's fist was split in two lengthwise, along with the rest of his arm. Even as his arm was instantly engulfed in flames of mana, Kamash still hadn't understood what had just happened. That was just how fast the empty sword had been swung and how irresistible Eugene's attack had been. But there was one thing that Kamash did understand. His death was drawing near. Was this because he had already died once? Kamash was well aware of just how empty death was. That was why he instinctively resisted its approach. Thanks to another desperate twist of his waist, Kamash managed to keep his throat from being sliced open. Instead, his entire right arm was sent flying. Gah! Kamash roared. Kamash didn't feel any pain from having his right arm sliced off. He had felt the touch of death from Eugene's sword as it cut off his arm and had almost reached his neck, but Kamash didn't feel any fear either. Where there should have been fear, there was only overflowing rage. Kamash moved his remaining arm, which was still intact. His fingers squeezed tightly around his dark power, compressing it into crystals as his feet kicked the ground. Sand exploded into the air. For a moment it seemed like the sky and the earth had switched places. Vast quantities of sand had been thrown into the sky, as a sandstorm with enough force to tear apart a large army engulfed Eugene. The feathers of prominence that were being held high above Eugene's head all fell to the ground. As they did so, the sky and the earth seemed to have swapped places once more. Eugene had cast a reversal spell through the mana stored within the feathers of prominence. Now that his vision was cleared, Eugene could see Kamash once more. The giant was holding a large crystal of dark power in his hand and was about to throw it at Eugene. Eugene let go of the holy sword with his left hand. He slowly raised his hand with the back facing outwards. A flickering flame was kindled in the palm that was facing toward Eugene. The flames that had surrounded Eugene were all being drawn into his hand. The black flames formed into a sphere. It might now be impossible for sunspots to appear within Eugene's flames as they had turned pitch black, but the method to conjure up an eclipse hadn't changed. Concentrate his mana in a single location, amplify it until it explodes, contain the explosion and wrap it in layers. With that, the construction of an eclipse was complete. Eugene turned his hand so that the back of his hand was now facing toward him and then gave a slight push with his palm. The eclipse, which was only about the size of his fist, shot forward. Its size was so small that it couldn't even be compared to the crystal of dark power that Kamash had created. It was so much smaller that it almost looked like a firefly in front of the sun. However, among all those watching this battle, not a single individual actually thought of looking down on the eclipse. Even the demon folk who had emerged from behind the Centipede Mountains could sense the terrible power contained in the ball of flames Eugene had just thrown. All the demon folk unconsciously took a step back and held their arms in front of them. By doing so, they readied themselves to absorb the force from the explosion as well as the aftershocks that would soon follow. The black wizards still hiding within the Centipede Mountains also reached the same conclusion. Amelia Merwin, who was standing in front of a group of liches, collapsed onto the ground, her face paling. "No, it can't be," Amelia silently despaired. She transmitted an absolute order to Kamash. "Don't try to resist it. Avoid it at all cost. So step back and prepare an evasive stance." Kamash's body almost moved to obey the command. But then, "I refuse," Kamash thought as he forcefully held his body in place. She wanted him to not resist? To avoid it at all costs? Even when he was alive, Kamash had never once shown such cowardly behavior. If Kamash had ever been wise enough and rational enough to do such a thing, then he wouldn't have continued to attack Vermouth and Hamel even after his limbs had been cut off. In the end, Kamash refused to back down, thrusting his left hand towards the eclipse. In looks alone, it might have been a firefly in front of the sun, but from the moment the two attacks made contact, the eclipse immediately dissolved the crystal of dark power. The dark power that had been condensed to its very limits simply burst apart like a balloon. The eclipse then kept gliding forward until it reached Kamash's hand. From the moment the eclipse touched his fingertips, Kamash's hand began disintegrating into dust. Kamash continued to pour out his dark power as he attempted to block the eclipse's advance. However, the eclipse continued to glide forward without any impediment, and eventually Kamash's entire left arm was destroyed. Then the eclipse suddenly detonated. A storm of mana swept over the desert. However, the storm wasn't strong enough to knock Kamash off his feet. Although he had lost his arms in mere instants, both of Kamash's legs were still intact. Pushing more strength into his legs, Kamash leaped forward. Opening his jaws wide, he let out a fierce roar. But Eugene was nowhere to be seen. Thud. Kamash felt something land on his chest. It was something very small. Kamash immediately lowered his eyes to look down at his chest. He saw Eugene standing there with both feet planted on Kamash's chest. "You're still as big as ever," Eugene muttered while pressing down on Kamash's chest with his feet. Fwoosh. The flames of prominence flared up on Eugene's back, sending Kamash's huge mass stumbling as he was suddenly pushed backward. Kamash hurriedly tried to brace himself by exerting more strength with his body. However, Eugene wasn't just simply using force to push the giant. From their point of contact at Eugene's feet, flames were drilling into Kamash's chest. "You," Kamash spat out, his face twisting in a grimace. He could only watch as Eugene grabbed hold of the holy sword with both hands and raised it over his head. Kamash recognized the sword. It was the same holy sword that Vermouth had once used. And he recognized the flames that enveloped Eugene's body and the way that the flames fluttered like a lion's mane. Kamash recognized it all. "You're not Vermouth and you're not Hamel either," Kamash growled. What was the point of stating the obvious? Eugene snorted as he erected layers of empty sword. Boom. He stomped on Kamash's chest one more time. Unable to hold on any longer, the giant fell backward. "Who are you?" Kamash demanded even as he fell. With his back towards the sun, Eugene held the holy sword aloft with both hands. "Eugene Lionheart," he replied. Kamash didn't know that name. And he wouldn't get the chance to remember that name in the future either. Black flames fell from the heavens. The moment that the giant's falling back touched down onto the desert, the empty sword dug into Kamash's neck. "Oh," Kamash silently sighed. 300 years ago, the great Vermouth had beheaded Kamash. But in this day and age, Vermouth was gone. Kamash realized this fact the moment his throat was sliced open. Right now, the one who was taking his head wasn't Vermouth. It wasn't even Hamel either. Eugene Lionheart. At the moment when the last blurs of his vision completely disappeared, a thought instinctively flashed through Kamash's mind: "I'm finally dying." Boom. The fallen Kamash would forever remain still. Right as Eugene was about to put away his holy sword and leave the giant's corpse behind, he thought of something. Oh, right. Could someone who had died a second time be re-resurrected as an undead? Eugene didn't know for sure whether that was the case, but he didn't want to leave any lingering annoyances behind. Eugene immediately created another eclipse out of one of Prominence's feathers and threw it down at Kamash's corpse. Only after confirming that the black flames had engulfed the entire body did Eugene fly back into the sky, then breathed out a sigh of relief. Phew, that was close. Eugene had told his companions that it would be over by the time they got here. If he hadn't managed to finish his fight with Kamash just now, on top of his embarrassment at allowing the fight to go on for so long, Eugene would have also had to face the shame of failing to live up to his word. Chapter 471, Horia 6. "Couldn't you have flown a bit faster?" Sienna complained, feeling slightly regretful. If Eugene hadn't managed to finish off Kamash by the time they arrived, she would have made sure to catch his weakness and poke a lot of fun at his expense. "I flew as fast I could," Rhaenyra defended herself. Sienna snorted, "Don't lie. Do you really think I wouldn't notice you adjusting your speed for Eugene's sake?" There was no basis for the harsh words that Sienna shot at Rhaenyra with a glare. This ill-tempered and slanderous archwizard was just making a fuss like she always did. I've never purposely slowed down," Rhaenyra muttered in an aggrieved voice. If it had been Eugene, Christina, or Anise being scolded by Sienna, they would have fought back without being intimidated, but unfortunately Rhaenyra just couldn't do that. "Stop making up nonsense and go sit down," Anise said as she walked up to where Sienna was standing and slapped the wizard on the shoulder. Sienna herself was aware that she was just fussing for no reason, so instead of arguing she just awkwardly cleared her throat a few times. "Ahem. As expected of my disciple, for him to be able to defeat such a large giant so quickly and all on his own." Although she was disappointed that she wouldn't get the chance to tease Eugene, his ability to take down the giant with strength to spare was deserving of praise. Especially because they had all clearly seen just how amazing Kamash's strength truly was, even when they were flying over from a distance. It would have been troublesome and disheartening if that huge giant had blocked the army from advancing or had rampaged through the front lines. Sir Eugene actually charged into the enemy camp all by himself in order to reduce the damage to his allies. Christina let out an excited shout. Although her words were mostly spoken in adulation, they also weren't all that incorrect. Even in Anise's opinion, the reason why Eugene flew ahead on his own had to be that he was concerned about the collateral damage to his allies due to Kamash's size. Well, it might be that he just wanted to kill Kamash personally, Anise muttered to herself as she glanced at Sienna. Sienna was proud of her disciple's performance. She cleared her throat once more in response to this glance and then nodded. "Well then, shall we get going?" Sienna prompted. The magic corps that were the pride of Aroth were being led by Tremple, while each of the tower masters led the wizards who belonged to their respective towers of magic. In the case of the Green Tower of Magic, whose position of the tower master was currently vacant, there was no choice but to leave Generic temporarily in charge. Sienna, Balzac, and Reincarnted were tasked with breaking through the Centipede Mountains. Of course, this didn't mean they would only attack the Centipede Mountains. If help was needed elsewhere or if there was a good opportunity to cause a rout, they would be able to lend a hand there as well. "Let's go," Sienna said confidently while turning to look at the other two. The Black Tower of Magic had been virtually disbanded, so Balzac was the only member who still belonged to the Black Tower of Magic. In fact, even if that hadn't been the case, it was still ridiculous for the Allies to have brought along a black wizard to this battlefield. Balzac was here only because Sienna had taken many precautions before allowing him to be here. "I'm afraid I won't be able to use blind," Balzac said with a disappointed look. If their opponent had fielded a human army as had been expected, then Balzac's signature spell, Blind, would have been able to come into play. However, the only humans currently on the battlefield were his allies. Even if he used Blind against the undead, demonic beasts and demon folk that made up the enemy army, they wouldn't be able to see much of an effect. "Don't do anything that might seem needlessly suspicious. Just serve as my assistant," Sienna ordered. "And make sure to eat in moderation." 1. "Understood," Balzac said, nodding obediently. If Balzac did anything suspicious, Sienna would kill him without any hesitation whatsoever. It was true that Balzac and Sienna had developed quite a lot of familiarity while working together, but even that wasn't enough to make Sienna hesitate if it came to killing him. She had never once forgotten that Balzac was a black wizard, and she was also mindful of the fact that Balzac would definitely become their enemy one day. Balzac was also aware of this fact. Although he had never imagined that things would turn out like this and he would be able to take part in such a battle, he felt that it was a great blessing for him to be able to fight alongside the wise Sienna. "There is nothing that I would change," Balzac thought happily. If Amelia was preparing to attempt the ritual to become a demon king like Edmund had been, Balzac might have been able to gain various benefits during that process. Still, Balzac didn't have any problems with how things had played out. "Through this war, I should be able to get closer to my secret desire," Balzac thought as he looked at Sienna with reverent eyes. The greatest and most exceptional wizard in all of history. The wizard who had gone beyond the limits of humanity, accepting the challenge to become the goddess of magic, and was actually showing signs of reaching her goal. The wise Sienna walked through the skies, holding frost in her hand. Whoosh! A galaxy unfolded behind Sienna. Reincarnted and Balzac followed further behind Sienna while feeling in awe of her. Below, the leader of the White Dragon Knights, Alcester, muttered in a trembling voice, "The empty sword." Ever since the night march, he had never gotten the chance to see Eugene fight in person. That was why Alcester couldn't help but be thrilled upon seeing Eugene's strength and the level of completion that the hero had reached with the empty sword. The empty sword was the secret technique that had been perfected by the Dragonic family over several generations. However, Alcester now got the feeling that he couldn't allow himself to remain complacent with his family's achievements. Eugene's empty sword had reached a far higher level than that of Alcester, the head of the Dragonic family. He didn't just use it with his sword, Alcester recalled. The black sphere that Eugene had thrown, the one that had destroyed the giant's crystallized dark power and arm all in one go, must have been created using the same techniques applied with the empty sword. This fact caused another tremor to run through Alcester. Was it anger because Eugene had arbitrarily used his family's secret techniques? There was no way that Alcester could be displeased by something like that. What Alcester was feeling right now was a big, almost indescribable surge of emotion. This was Eugene Lionheart, the hero who would defeat the demon kings and save the world. To think that our family's secret technique, the empty sword that he learned from me, could be used so exquisitely, Alcester thought in excitement. Alcester grinned as he savored this fact once more. He kept this grin up until the army had arrived at a certain point. Setting aside his satisfaction for now, Alcester lifted his hand. The riders following him raised the banner of the White Dragon Knights immediately. Soon the other army units had all raised their banners aloft. Their enemies were gradually coming into range. Beyond the giant's corpse that was being consumed by Eugene's black flames, the undead army had begun to advance over the still pitch-black desert. But the demonic beast had already begun to move even before the undead did. Although they couldn't be compared to Camash, let alone the Centipede Mountains, the demonic beasts running towards them were so large that every single one of them could tower over a sizable mansion. They all belonged to a category of super demonic beasts. They weren't just called that due to their large size. Unlike other monsters, these demonic beasts were made up of pure dark power. Some of the demonic beasts who were racing ahead of the pack opened their jaws wide. Dark power was being concentrated between their jaws. It was clear what would happen next. This dark power would soon be shot out like a dragon's breath. The moment that the demonic beasts moved into action, the allied forces immediately prepared a response. Following Tremple's orders, the magic corps all cast a spell simultaneously. A dense magical barrier covered the front of the entire army. At the same time, various counterspells were also prepared. In the rear, the wizards of the Red Tower of Magic, led by Lovelian, all drew summoning circles, from which hundreds of cannons were deployed. Boom 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 boom. The opening shot of the battle came when all of the cannons began firing simultaneously. All the different countries began unleashing their artillery. Aratha's magic cannons had been predicted to perform the best in terms of firepower, but in actuality that didn't turn out to be the case. The Lionheart's cannons, which had been crammed full of the dwarves' wildest imaginations, were firing the most destructive mana cannonballs with an absurdly loud roar. Boom boom boom. The artillery shells passed through the barrier and struck the demonic beasts. The demonic beasts that were hit by the shells were forced to stumble on their feet. There hadn't been any casualties yet, but the demonic beasts' advance had been halted. But the enemy didn't just sit there dumbfounded. In response, the condensed dark power exploded out of their mouths. The dark power sprayed out in a conical shape like a dragon's breath. A layer of light began to shine on top of the dense magical barrier. The priests from the Luminous Covenant who had been stationed near the artillery forces all performed a miracle together as if they had been waiting for this timing. Except for the Knights of the Blood Cross, the paladins taking part in the expedition had been given the duty of guarding the priests, but they also provided support to the priests by generating spare divine power. Although it had proven possible to halt the advance of all these large demonic beasts with artillery fire alone, it seemed that it would still be difficult to annihilate them with cannons alone. As soon as this verdict was reached, all the cannons were aimed higher. This change in angle was made to target the undead troops who were following behind the demonic beasts. The Beast King of Ruhr, the only monarch to personally participate in this war, let out a roar, "Charge!" King Amon and his Knights of Ruhr were all riding on wolves, but the wolf that Amon was riding was the largest of them all. That wolf was Abel, the same humongous wolf that had once served as Eugene's guide through the snowfields. Amon and the White Fangs galloped ahead of the army, spurring on their wolves. Seated on a huge black stallion, Gilead called out, "Scion." "Yes, Sir Patriarch," Scion replied, also riding on a horse next to Gilead. Scion felt glad that he was wearing a helmet. Although he had already experienced the battlefield during his time in the rainforest, he couldn't help but be nervous when faced with a war on this scale. Conscious of the stiffness in his cheeks, Scion turned to look at Gilead. "You seem nervous," Gilead said with a glance at Scion. Scion's true feelings had already been seen through. But before Scion could say anything in response, Gilead admitted with a grin, "I'm also feeling a bit nervous." "Huh?" Scion gawked in surprise. "Just because it's me, did you really think I was an old hand at war?" Gilead laughed. "Let alone a war. It's been a long time since I even fought seriously." Scion's eyes widened into circles at these words. Why hadn't he realized this before? After all, it was only natural. Scion couldn't think of anything to say and could only flap his lips soundlessly. Until now, the world had mostly been at peace. And it wasn't like there were many nobles who would dare to make enemies of the Lionhearts. Thanks to that, the Lionhearts had never really had an enemy to fight against. They also never had to duel with the other nobles or engage in a territorial war. The closest that the Black Lion Knights usually came to actual combat was through their combat training. In fact, their training was very close to the real thing. But what about the main family or the Knights of the White Lion? They might both train regularly, but even with that, this would be their first time going to war. Scion hesitated. Patriarch. I might be nervous, but..." Gilead began speaking calmly as his exit shifted in response to his will, and his helmet opened up slightly, revealing Gilead's face. "But more than that, I'm excited. It feels like my blood is boiling." In his entire life, this was Scion's first time seeing such an expression on his father's face. His father's usually stern visage, which had always been full of majesty as befitting the patriarch of their clan, now had an out-of-place grin resting on it. Cyan, Gilead called out once more. Why yes. Cyan stammered. Make sure to watch my back just so that this father of yours doesn't end up running too wild, Gilead warned with an excited grin. Cyan was struck silent. As my son, I can only leave my rear to you, Gilead said, his smile changing. Now, Gilead's smiling expression was full of his kindness, love and trust in his children. Cyan's shoulders trembled for a second, then he nodded firmly, yes. To think that Gilead and his son would actually end up standing on the same battlefield together. No, it wasn't just his son. Somewhere high in the sky, his daughter was also present. And also, his other son was returning to the army after going ahead to defeat a giant all on his own. Eugene isn't the only Lionheart here, Gilead said as he lowered his helmet shut. So let us go and relieve some of that boy's burden. Gilead raised his sword high. Aya. All of the White Lion Knights riding along behind him roared in unison. Then all of the White Lion Knights charged forward as one. Soon after, Ordis and the Knights of Shimuan also charged together, then came Ivik and the other mercenaries. Finally, Ivatar and the warriors of the Zoran tribe also ran forward while roaring their war cries. Kaiwea. Dozens of flying demonic beasts flapped their wings through the skies above. When Rhaenyra hesitated, unsure of what she should do, the squadrons that had been flying along behind her also charged forward. Thump. I should have cleared up the skies a bit before returning, Eugene muttered as he landed on Rhaenyra's back. Why organize an army if you're just going to try and do everything yourself? Sienna asked sarcastically. Eugene gave her a serious answer. No matter how strong I am, if I try to wipe them all out by myself, I'll still end up running out of strength. Since you are already well aware of that, why are you complaining? Anise pointed out impatiently as she grabbed Eugene's wrist. Are you hurt anywhere? There's no way I would get hurt just from facing a single bastard like him, Eugene scoffed. Anise sighed. If you had showed up with even a single scratch on you, I was ready to tear strips out of your hide. Don't you think that response is way too harsh for someone who went out and fought so hard on his own like I did? Eugene pouted. Shouldn't you give me some compliments instead? You did a really good job, Anise said with a bright smile as she patted Eugene's hand. Feeling a bit embarrassed by this treatment, Eugene awkwardly turned his head to the other side. Down below he could see the advancing banners. Charging along at the very front was the standard of the Lionheart clan. Several other standards were running along behind it. Lifting his head, Eugene turned to face the front. He saw the flying squadrons that had flown ahead clashing against the demonic beasts. The first thing that caught his eye was the sight of Raphael swinging a claymore atop the giant Apollo. Casually, Eugene began looking for some of the familiar faces amongst the flying squadrons. He first looked at the black lions riding their wyverns. Carmen had left her wyvern to fly on its own, leaping on top of a demonic beast and pounding it with her fists. Not far away, Guion was skillfully piloting his wyvern while swinging a sword. Eugene also spotted Genos performing an Azura rampage. Desra and Gargith were both easy to find as well. Then there was Seal. She was using Javel's long narrow blade like a spear, slicing open the demonic beast's hides. For a moment, Eugene just stared at the flames fluttering around Seal like a lion's mane. Should I have just come here on my own? Eugene muttered to himself. Are you talking about abandoning us as well? Anise challenged him. Eugene hesitated. Well, in the case of you guys, you would have followed me even if I had told you not to. They would have probably done the same, Anise said with a smile as she held Eugene's hand. You didn't summon them here. They all came here for your sake. But they came here because I intended to start this war, Eugene argued guiltily. Anise raised a brow. If you think that was a mistake, then what's the point of doing any of this? Eugene shook his head. I don't have any regrets. It's just that suddenly I couldn't help but have second thoughts. Even if someone dies here, it won't be your fault. Anise paused before shaking her head. No, I shouldn't put it like that. It's certainly true that you did intend for this war to break out. They also came here for your sake and the sake of the whole world. So perhaps in a way all of this is indeed your fault. Anise's palm gently pressed down on Eugene's hand. Eugene felt the stigmata that had been carved into the soft skin of her palm. In that case, as the saint, allow me to forgive you of your sins. I will also pray for everyone who dies here so that they will go to heaven instead of hell, Anise vowed. Ha! Eugene unconsciously let out a laugh. Heaven, she says. It's been a while since I last heard those words, Eugene said with a wry smile. There's always someone on the battlefield praying that those who die will go to heaven. As the saint, it's only befitting for me to take up the responsibility for that prayer, Anise said, smiling along with Eugene. She let go of Eugene's hand and spun around. The priests of the graceful radiance were all down on their knees, looking up at Anise and Eugene. The saints' consciousnesses swapped places. Well then, now let's do what needs to be done, Anise whispered from inside their head. Having taken control of their body, Christina slowly took a deep breath and nodded. Well then, now let's do what needs to be done. While repeating the exact words as Anise, Christina unfurled her wings. Fwoosh! Her 8 wings were spread wide open. The priests of the graceful radiance lifted their hands in prayer at this sight and bowed their heads deeply. Aya! A circle of light was drawn on the center of Rhaimyra's back. Please go ahead, Christina said. Maze, the sole wizard left standing on Rhaimyra's back, was momentarily entranced by the show of piety from these priests, but he quickly straightened his expression and nodded his head. Yes, Maze said as he raised his staff. Then he cast his signature, the battleship. The spell that was usually used to arm an entire ship with magic now enveloped Rhaimyra. Oh! Rhaimyra cried out in excitement. Although they had practiced this in advance, Rhaimyra still felt a great deal of excitement when the time came for her actual performance. Battleship's magic successfully armed Rhaimyra. Rhaimyra also didn't just stay still during all of this. One of the titles that was often used to describe dragons was Masters of Magic. So Rhaimyra used her own draconic incantation to supplement Battleship's formula. This lady is now both a dragon and a battleship. Rhaimyra cried out excitedly as she flapped her wings. In mere moments their altitude had climbed up considerably. As Rhaimyra ascended higher than the flock of flying demonic beasts fighting in front of her, she could clearly see how Horia had been totally encircled by the Centipede Mountains. She couldn't see into the city all that clearly. This was because of the pitch-black veil of dark power that covered the top of the city like a roof. Try and take a shot at it, Eugene suggested. Benefactor, do you want to take a look at this lady's breath? Rhaimyra responded with excitement. Eugene encouraged her. If you want to shoot, then you should just shoot. Until now, she had been so excited and impatient that if Eugene hadn't allowed her to use her breath soon, it would have been obvious that Rhaimyra was going to lose her temper. Take a look at this lady's strength, Rhaimyra exclaimed as a flashing light pierced through the sky. Chapter 472, Horia, 7. This was Seal's first time riding her wyvern into actual combat, but surprisingly enough, she didn't meet with any problems. Usually, monsters like wyverns were so scared of demonic beasts that it would be difficult to make them attack. But even their monsters' instinctive fears had been erased by blessings granted by the priests. However, these blessings couldn't help with some minor physiological discomforts felt by the riders. The demonic beast that Seal, along with dozens of other wyvern riders, was currently facing was a giant, insectoid demonic beast. Although she didn't really want to describe it in detail, if she had to make a comparison, the demonic beast looked like a huge cockroach that had been glued together with the wings of a dragonfly and the limbs of a praying mantis. Every time its 4 wings fluttered, it summoned windstorms as sharp as blades, and each swing of its forelimbs, which were bent like scythes, was sharper than a slash made with sword force. It was a bit smaller than a dragon. However, that meant it was still much larger than a wyvern. And though they might have different appearances, dozens of demonic beasts of similar size were occupying the sky around it. The flying squadron's role was to prevent these demonic beasts from directing their attacks at those marching below and, if possible, neutralize them as quickly as possible so that they could go on to provide some ground support. Although she had little actual experience with aerial combat, Seal was performing quite well. She used Javel, which was as flexible as a whip, to penetrate the thick hides of the demonic beasts, and whenever she saw a clear opening she would unleash one of the powers of her demon eye. But the stronger her opponent, the greater the cost of restraining it with the power of immobility. The power of darkness, however, could be used comfortably even with Seal's current strength, especially if she only used it to attack. As it swung its forelimbs while flying towards them, the demonic beast's movements gradually began to slow down. Hoping to take advantage of this opening, Seal plunged spikes created from her demon eye of darkness into the joints of the demonic beast's wings. Once she had done so, the demonic beast's body began to lean precariously to one side. But right at the moment when Seal was about to launch another attack, Ruhr, a thick breath attack swept over her head. Startled by the loud sound and the density of the mana contained within the breath, Seal raised her head. That was her breath? Seal muttered in shock. So Rhaenyra finally got a chance to show it off. Seal let out an amused snort and pulled on her reins. Everyone flying in the sky was surprised when Rhaenyra's breath suddenly burst out. Even Carmen, who had mounted one of the demonic beasts and was taking it down all by herself, felt surprised as she turned to stare at Rhaenyra. "Oh," Carmen murmured in awe. She had just seen Rhaenyra, who was armed and armored by the battleship spell. The combination of the two had created the appearance of a dragon wearing a magical suit of armor, and Carmen couldn't help but feel a sense of romance at this sight. Wasn't something like that also a complete transformation? Carmen trembled, her fists shaking in excitement before raising both her arms high and shouting, "Transform!" Fwoosh! Her exit deployed around her. Now transformed into her dragon lion form, Carmen slashed down with both her fists, which had gained sharp nails like a dragon's claws. "Dragon Claw!" Carmen called out her attack in a quiet whisper. Her voice may have been low, but the power of her attack was by no means weak. Cracker crack crackle. The flames of the white flame formula poured out from her claws that had been sunk deep into the body of the demonic beast. Pop pop pop. The demonic beast's body, having been injected with flames, began to bulge out on all sides. Without further delay, Carmen withdrew her claws and leaped off of the demonic beast's back. Boom! A huge explosion erupted. Carmen, who was leaping away with her back toward the explosion, spun a few times in midair before landing on top of her wyvern's back. Her trusty steed, her trusty Crimson Waltz, took the impact of Carmen's landing without any difficulty and spread her wings with a roar. Hiding her inner satisfaction at her spectacular landing after leaping away from an explosion, Carmen turned her head as she belatedly realized something. Rhaenyra had obviously fired her breath at the barrier. However, there hadn't been any further sounds after that. That can't be. To think that this lady's breath would. I knew it would turn out like this. Rhaenyra might have been flustered by the outcome, but Eugene just furrowed his brow and let out a grumble. Rhaenyra's breath had definitely burned through the air and crashed into the barrier. However, it didn't seem to have any effect on the barrier. When her breath made contact with the surface of the barrier, no explosion had erupted. All it had done was cause the barrier to ripple slightly. The dark power of destruction that made up the barrier had nullified her breath right at the moment of contact. After all, there is so much dark power poured into the barrier that it even makes the technical quality of the barrier insignificant, Eugene muttered to himself. All of this dark power had thoroughly and thickly covered the entire sky above the city. From now on you are a demon king. Although Eugene had been the one to say this, he had no choice but to re-evaluate the specter's true strength once more. If he was able to freely control such levels of dark power, then the specter already deserved to be treated as a demon king. We won't be able to break through with just a breath, Eugene speculated. A dragon's breath was just a mass of pure mana. The same thing applied to spells. The most effective solution to this type of barrier was divine power, which was the antithesis of dark power. Or else an even stronger power. I should save my divine sword for later, Eugene decided after careful consideration. Currently, the number of times that Eugene could use his ability of the divine sword was only thrice a day. So it would be a waste to use one of those times just to break through this barrier. Let's get closer, Eugene said out loud. But, benefactor, the barrier still hasn't been broken, Rhaenyra protested. That's why we're going over there to break it, Eugene confidently stated. Rhaenyra was shaken by his assertiveness. Eep. Until now, Rhaenyra had had such strong momentum, but she must have been thoroughly shocked when her breath was nullified without doing any damage. However, Rhaenyra soon came to her senses and accelerated forward. If she were on her own, she would have definitely run away, but right now she had both Eugene and the Saint riding on her back. Benefactor. I can feel it. That isn't just a simple defensive barrier. The barrier itself gives off an ominous feeling, Rhaenyra warned. That certainly seems likely. If we get too close, that dense dark power will probably shoot at us like a barrage of artillery fire, Eugene said with a somber expression. However, Rhaimyra's eyes couldn't help but tremble in fear as she heard Eugene say this. Eugene felt her trembling beneath him and chuckled. "Don't worry." Rhaimyra just groaned uncertainly. Since Eugene had already voiced his confidence, Rhaimyra also mustered up all her courage. Eugene wasn't simply relying on his words alone to reassure Rhaimyra. Maze's battleship spell as well as the graceful Radiance's holy magic, under the direction of the saint, all of that came together to cover Rhaimyra from head to toe in protection. Boom! When they got closer to the Centipede Mountains, a loud roar was heard from below them. When they looked down, they saw Sienna, who had a galaxy of stars floating behind her back. She was shooting out giant spheres one after another as if she were pulling the stars out from the galaxy behind her. Balzac and Reinian were standing near Sienna as if they were acting as her guards. With every swing of Balzac's hand, the undead collapsed around them. Reinian seemed to just be standing quietly with her hands held together in a seal, but the desert around her was churning and seething. This phenomenon seemed to have something to do with her signature. "Indeed, it's just as solid as I expected it to be," Sienna muttered. Even though Sienna had confidently cast all her spells at it, the Centipede Mountains remained standing. It might be because this guy's carapace was just that hard, but it was more likely that the dark power of the barrier was also granting a protective effect on the Centipede Mountains as well. Boom! Once more Sienna fired off another star. Though her spells had proven ineffective, there was no doubt that Sienna's attack had managed to draw out more of a reaction from the barrier than Rhaimyra's breath had. Unlike Rhaimyra's breath, which had been erased as soon as it touched the barrier, Sienna's spells would explode and create shockwaves whenever they struck the Centipede Mountains or the barrier. However, neither of the two defenses showed any signs of collapse. Eugene thought he might be able to rush in if they could only manage to destroy one of them, either the Centipede Mountains or the barrier, but it seemed like he would be forced to destroy them together. Eugene grunted, his brow furrowing as he turned to look backward. A demon folk was catching up to them from behind. He had a hulking reptile-like body, was covered in scales and had curved horns. Had Eugene seen this guy somewhere? Eugene suddenly remembered something. He was that guy, the 26th ranked demon folk. This demon folk was currently leading dozens of similar-looking subordinates in hot pursuit of Rhaimyra. Their intention was obvious. They were coming to prevent Eugene from attacking the barrier. They might also be aiming to get a dragon heart, Eugene idly considered. There had been a large-scale purge going on within the Demon King's Castle of Babel, and the surviving demon folk had been granted the dark power of incarceration. Eugene had also happened to hear that news. But as the 26th ranked demon folk, was that really enough for him to step forward to meet the hero with such confidence? Eugene's lips twisted in an amused grin. Christina noticed something. "Sir Eugene?" "I'll be back soon," Eugene reassured her. The feathers of prominence flew backward. Before Christina had time to do anything to stop him, Eugene spatially leaped in front of the pursuing demon folk, who were busy trying to narrow the distance gradually. The demon folk were just as surprised as Christina had been when Eugene suddenly appeared right in front of them. But they didn't let out any panicked shouts. Instead, the 26th ranked demon folk at their head immediately readied himself for battle, and his subordinates who were following behind him also did the same. Their murderous intent was all focused on one point and aimed squarely at Eugene. Eugene had met this demon once before, 300 years ago. Although Hamel hadn't made his name, even back then this demon folk had been a fighter of adequate skill. Indeed, if he weren't so skilled, it would have been difficult to survive these past 300 years until he reached this present day. Currently, the fact that the demon was already moving into action mere moments after their collision had taken place was also quite impressive. In this sort of situation, trying to have a conversation was useless. What was the point of the two sides talking in the first place when their only goal was to try and kill each other? That was why Eugene also didn't feel the need to say anything. Even at this very moment, Rhaimyra was drawing closer to the Centipede Mountains. Eugene couldn't afford to spend too much time dealing with these pesky pursuers. He reached into his cloak and wrapped his hand around the hilt of the moonlight sword. As he drew it, he immediately swung it forward. At the moment of Eugene's swing, the blade shot out a ray of pale moonlight. Eugene's black flames were mixed in with the moonlight. Following the completion of his training with the divine sword, the light of the moonlight sword now contained traces of Eugene's black flames as well as the poison spread by the Nur that had covered all of Lahanjar. The moonlight sliced the sky in two. The black flames seemed to want to spill over the sides of the slash, but the gray moonlight caught the flames in its forward rush as it raced across the sky. "What is that?" the demon folks thought as they fearfully watched the moonlight surge towards them. The demon at the head of their group roared as he unleashed his dark power of incarceration in response. But it was of no use. If it were the demon king of incarceration himself who had unleashed the dark power, then it might have been a different story, but there was no way to stop this moonlight with mere borrowed dark power. If the demon had wanted to increase his chances of winning even slightly, or at least have something close to an actual battle with Eugene, he should have never attacked Eugene head-on. If he was smart, the demon should have avoided having such a confrontation as best as he possibly could. It was already too late. Eugene didn't give him the opportunity to make a different choice. Once Eugene had turned around to face his pursuers, approached them and swung his sword, the outcome had already been decided. The intuition of the former god of war had already foreseen these results. So what if he was ranked 26th? So what if he had the dark power of incarceration? With just those, there was no way for him to affect the outcome. Without even confirming the aftermath personally, Eugene turned back around. Crackle. Leaping to one of the feathers he had left on Rhaenyra's back, Eugene returned to where he had just been standing. Instead of Eugene, Maze was left slack-jawed when he turned to look behind at the aftermath. The wave of moonlight that had been spreading across the sky flickered out like a spent match. There was nothing left behind in its wake. The dozens of demon folks who had been letting out such ferocious killing intense moments before had all been annihilated in a single slash. Well, what was that? Maze gaped. Although Maze wasn't sure if this was an appropriate thought to have. That sword definitely didn't seem like it should belong to the hero. It was even more frightening than when Maze had faced the Demon King of Fury at sea. And it felt much more cruel and ominous than all the demonic beasts, demon folks, and the undead advancing across the desert beneath them. However, the hero who had held that sword and defeated a demon king while drenched in his own blood, with a mischievous expression and casual tone, had arrived on the battlefield before anyone else, slain a giant, and cut down all of the demon folks who had been pursuing them in a single blow. That hero. I can somewhat understand Princess Scalia's devotion, Mace thought with a snort as he shook his head. In Shimuin, active worship of the hero Eugene Lionheart was already being led by Princess Scalia. She had taken charge of a liturgy that she forced on the royal family every month, and she also performed these liturgies whenever crowds of citizens and tourists had gathered together like thick clouds in front of Eugene's statue in Cheddar. The way she appeared when giving those public sermons, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to decide that she was already at the head of a full-fledged religion and granted the official name, the Church of the Hero. Climb up a bit, Eugene instructed. He hadn't put the moonlight sword back into his cloak. Instead, Eugene set it down at his feet, where he could comfortably pick it up again. With his right hand still holding on to the holy sword, Eugene held it up in front of him. At some point, Rhaenyra had already flown over the top of the Centipede Mountains. However, when they looked down, they still couldn't see Horia City below them. This was because the black veil of dark power covering the city was too thick. Eugene eventually told Rhaenyra, "There's no need to go any further. You can stop here." Immediately after Eugene had said this, Rhaenyra stopped moving forward. She was able to maintain her altitude and position in the air just by keeping her wings outspread. Eugene stepped off of Rhaenyra's back and unfurled his wings of prominence. Eugene had reached his other hand into his cloak to take hold of Akasha. Even with its help, he couldn't completely see through the barrier's formula. However, it wasn't like he didn't manage to see anything at all. It keeps on building up. Eugene realized. Whenever Sienna attacked the barrier, ripples would spread across its surface. As the internal shockwaves continued to accumulate, the magic formulas contained within the barrier were collapsing. Since they couldn't allow the barrier to break, whenever the formulas underlying it began to collapse, the wizards within would hurriedly reinforce the spell. "That bitch," Eugene cursed as his lips twisted in a sneer. His eyes might not be able to see through this veil in front of him, but he could very easily imagine the scene occurring on the other side. He could just see Amelia Merwin huddling behind the barrier. The woman who had been a fatal threat to Eugene in the past when he was still weak. The woman who had robbed the tomb built for him by his comrades and who had created a death knight from his corpse. And after that, even when Eugene had met her once more at the night march, the woman had still shown an irreverent and bossy attitude towards him. But in fact, even under those circumstances, Amelia had still decided to hide away in her mouse hole because she grew so scared of him and Sienna. That bitch was waiting for Eugene down below. She had erected this barrier in a desperate attempt to stay safe and would be doing her best to hold it up in order to prevent anyone from breaking through. While holding Vladimir up with both hands, with dozens of liches kneeling behind her, Amelia had to be leveraging all the support she could muster to keep the barrier whole. "I really want to see the look on your face when you fail," Eugene muttered as he held the holy sword aloft. In response to his actions, Christina also stretched both hands forward. Fwish! The stigmata engraved on her palm began to glow as the priests of the graceful radiance brought their hands together in prayer. Their bodies had all been implanted with the holy relics that the Holy Empire of Eurus had managed to artificially develop after hundreds of years of research. Implanting these relics had taken away from them the chance to enjoy their lives as normal humans, but in place of that, it had given them powerful reserves of divine power. One battle priest of the graceful radiance was the equivalent of 100 ordinary priests. Besides that, Eugene also had a saint marked with the genuine stigmata at his side. So currently, it was as if there were thousands of priests praying together on Rhaimyra's back. Their prayers all resonated with each other, and their collective divine power gathered into a single mass. By doing so, a massive source of light was created. "No way," Maze gasped quietly. Was it really alright for a wizard like him to be here in a place like this? Suppressing his instinctive trembling, Maze gulped nervously. It was a widely known fact that wizards did not believe in the gods. This made it difficult for wizards and priests to be ideologically compatible. Magic was created by combining sophisticated formulas with the world's mana that had clear proof of existence. On the other hand, just how clumsy and ambiguous did the holy magic that priests use seem in comparison? A priest's divine power depended on their faith. It was said that the gods still existed somewhere, and they granted their priests power in accordance with their faith. So what about holy magic? It also made use of certain formulas, but the rules weren't as clearly defined as with circles magic. One wasn't able to use holy magic if one lacked faith, and even if two people were performing the same holy spell, the power of the spell would be different depending on the differences in their level of faith. Moreover, there were also miracles that didn't make use of any formulas whatsoever. They could only be performed by truly great priests. That's right, if one were using wizarding terms, these real priests who could skillfully use miracles were the arch-wizards of the church. Honestly speaking, it was hard to understand how it all still worked. Or at least that was what Maze had always thought about it up until now. Maze wasn't the only wizard who thought that way. This was actually the case for most wizards. In fact, this should be a feeling shared by all arch-wizards. For wizards, the only god worthy of any discussion was the wise Sienna, who was steadily seeking a way to turn herself into a god through the use of magic. That was what Maze had always thought, but now? Is this a miracle? Maze wondered in awe. Their surroundings were filled with light. Maze eventually collapsed into his seat, unable to suppress his trembling any longer. When the prayers that the priests were reciting resonated as one, it sounded like a song. And it almost seemed like a trumpet was being sounded from somewhere high in the sky. From the light that currently filled his surroundings, Maze felt a warmth that seemed to be bathing his soul. The black veil was still waiting below them. The sky above it was overcast due to the influence of all this dark power. This was also the center of the battlefield, and they were currently flying over a city that had been occupied by a demon king. All of this made this place an ominous and terrible location. However, it didn't really feel that way. At this very moment, Maze felt that this place had to be the center of the world and the warmest and brightest place he had ever been in. Maze saw the figure of the saint with her wings outspread. Christina was directing the flow of light. His eyes followed the light flow being guided toward the hero's sword. "Would you like to convert to the church?" A soft voice approached Maze. Startled, Maze turned his head. It was the saint, Christina Rogerus. With her 8 wings outspread, she looked like an angel, and with the stigmata engraved hand held up towards the sky, it almost seemed as if she was holding up the heavens. Her smile made it seem as if she could understand everything Maze was thinking and every emotion he was feeling. "The light will always welcome any lost lamb who feels the faith," Christina said invitingly. "A lamb," she said. To think he would actually be called something like that at his age. Maze let out a snort and shook his head. "No. I have no intention of joining the Church of the Light." "So not the light, Christina's grin grew a little wider. Her narrow eyes were curved in a smile, but her blue pupils shone beautifully through the slight opening. Maze smiled in embarrassment at having had his true intentions seen through by her. "I intend to convert to the Church of the Hero," Maze admitted. He still wasn't too sure about the existence of gods. However, the light that surrounded him and the figure of the hero who was connected to everyone here gave this archwizard who had devoted his entire life to magic a different sense of awe than what magic had always given him. "I bid you welcome," Christina said with a warm smile. As the light connecting everyone was drawn into the holy sword, the sword of light split apart the darkness. Chapter 473, Horia 8. Bonus image. Gafk. Amelia cried out as she arched backward at the waist. The pain was rising from the very tips of her toes as if her very nerve endings were being chewed upon. Her internal organs all felt like they were being flipped upside down, and it felt like her core was shattering. Amelia's head had bent backward along with her waist and dark bloody froth spilled from her wide-open jaws. Amelia wasn't the only one to have suffered such an assault. Behind her, dozens of liches were spasming in their seats and twisting their bones in agony as they screamed in pain. All these liches had recently raised their levels by sucking out the souls of the lower-leveled black wizards who weren't qualified to become liches. The liches might now possess bodies that were no longer physically capable of spitting out blood, but that didn't mean they were free from pain and injury. The shock of the blow just now was strong enough that it had even been transmitted to the liches' most vital possession, their life vessels. That was just how powerful the last attack that had struck the barrier had been. Just the spells that were being shot at them by the wise Sienna alone had been enough to set them gritting their teeth in pain, but that attack just now, the impact was so agonizing that it felt as if their souls were being torn apart. If that attack had been made using magic, it wouldn't have been as life-threatening as it was, but since it had been made using divine power, it was a whole other story. "This is absurd." Amelia internally wrestled with her own feelings of denial as she coughed up even more blood. Amelia had both Vladimir and the dark power drawn from her contract with the Demon King of Incarceration on her side. The barrier was also created using the dark power of destruction. Even for the wise Sienna, breaking through the barrier with magic alone would be impossible. As for divine power, fine, Amelia would admit that the light was the antithesis of dark power. However, it wasn't like the god of light himself could descend to take care of them. So even if their opponent was the hero or the saint, was it really possible for them to push this barrier, which had had so much power invested into it, to the brink of destruction with just one sword strike? "The barrier hasn't been destroyed yet," Amelia told herself as she swallowed a mouthful of blood and tightened her grip on Vladimir. After Amelia gripped Vladimir with both hands and held the staff above her head, her sinister dark power stirred as a magic circle appeared surrounding her. The liches also brought their hands together in a seal as they resumed reciting a chant. The sword of light wielded by Eugene had split open the barrier, creating an opening that was as large as the sword's slash. However, Eugene couldn't completely destroy the barrier with just that. His eyes still shining with light, Eugene glared down at the slash-shaped opening. He saw that the dark power making up the barrier was already beginning to stick back together as the barrier was being restored. Eugene raised the holy sword once more. Whoosh! The circle of light that had appeared over Rhaimyra's back grew even larger. The sky, which had been overcast due to the influence of the dark power below, was illuminated by this circle of light. Amelia and the liches didn't just stay still during all of this. After the surface of the barrier began bubbling like it was boiling, a spike of dark power was suddenly shot toward Rhaimyra. Eek! Rhaimyra yelped in shock. Naturally, Rhaimyra tried to dodge it, but Eugene's voice stopped her before she could move. "You don't have to dodge it." Suppressing her fear, Rhaimyra stayed where she was. Eugene didn't swing his sword directly at the attack. However, he did think about blocking it, and that alone was enough. All of the light now surrounding them obeyed Eugene's will, so when Eugene had this thought, the light immediately moved to block the spike. Of course, the retaliation from the barrier didn't end with just one shot. Spikes were fired out one after another and blades struck out from the barrier like whips. However, none of them managed to reach Rhaimyra. Screech! The sword of light struck the barrier once more. Taking into account the previous backlash, Amelia and the liches had strengthened the barrier even further, but it was of no use. This time as well, the sword of light managed to split apart the dark power of the barrier. Brrr! Just as Eugene was about to deliver another strike with the holy sword, something huge rose up from inside the barrier. Kaya! Rhaenyra screamed in surprise. Her screams weren't unwarranted. The terrifying and disgusting head of a centipede could now be seen flying towards them. Due to Eugene's successive attacks, the head of the Centipede Mountains had finally been driven into taking action personally. "Hey now," Eugene muttered in faint surprise. In the past, this demonic beast had once been mistaken as an actual mountain range, and currently, it had managed to completely enclose the entirety of this huge city. The Centipede Mountain's head was just as gigantic as its body, and it almost looked like it could swallow a dragon like Rhaenyra in a single bite. The corners of Eugene's mouth curled up in a grin. He didn't feel any fear or intimidation when faced with this gigantic monster. Instead, he felt a sense of gratitude. To think that it would actually come out in person from behind that solid barrier that was proving so difficult to break through. "Sienna." Eugene called out Sienna's name in a low voice as he raised the moonlight sword he was holding in his other hand. Down below them, Sienna was still shooting her spells at the barrier. Although she wasn't able to physically hear his voice, Sienna nodded her head once Eugene's intentions were conveyed with Mare's help. "Aha!" Sienna nodded firmly as the galaxy hovering behind her underwent a transformation. The countless stars began to rotate, creating hundreds of circles. Sienna's eyes sparkled like colorful jewels, and frost left Sienna's hand to start floating in midair. "Oh," Balzac and Rhaenys both gasped in awe. Just like how Maze had felt the presence of God coming from Eugene while standing in the midst of that light, Balzac and Rhaenys, who had been accompanying Sienna, also felt like they were in the presence of a god. All the mana that existed within this space was moving according to Sienna's will. Soon Sienna turned her indomitable will to fashioning a spell. Through the use of absolute decree, Sienna's iron will could determine the effect that her spell would have in advance. At the same time, Eugene also began to fall downwards. This was to prevent Rhaenyra and the others riding on her back from getting caught up in his attack. Rhaenyra quickly stammered, "Be benefactor, what should I?" "Just close your eyes and count to 10, Eugene instructed. The mere sight of the next scene might cause some psychological harm to a child's mental state. Of course, Eugene was well aware that Rhaenyra wasn't really a child, but even so, was something like physical age really all that important? Eugene felt that what would be occurring next would be a disgusting sight for children and adults alike. Mare also did the same thing as Rhaenyra and began to count to 10 with her eyes closed from inside the cloak. Eugene chuckled as he heard her voice and tossed the holy sword back over his shoulder. The discarded holy sword didn't fall to the ground but instead began to float amid the light. Eugene held onto the moonlight sword with both hands. He then activated his white flame formula, summoning up his black flames. 2. Eugene layered up the empty sword. A large, dark mass that in no way resembled flames now clung to the blade of the moonlight sword. 3. 4. The dully glowing mass moved to the tip of Eugene's sword. 5. Eugene swung the moonlight sword. The dark lump left the tip of his sword, then fell down towards the Centipede Mountain's wide-open mouth. Demonic beasts didn't possess higher intelligence. But that said, they still possessed survival instincts. Since it didn't know what that dark lump was, the Centipede Mountains instinctively felt that it was something that shouldn't be swallowed. So the Centipede Mountains tried to avoid it. However, its dodge failed. The Centipede Mountains was frozen in place the moment it tried to twist its body out of the way. It felt as if the world itself was exerting a tight grip on its entire body. The force holding the Centipede Mountains in place was so immense that it couldn't be explained any other way. 6. Finally, the dark lump fell directly into the mouth of the Centipede Mountain. 7. It was hard to hear what happened next. The max-layered empty sword tore apart the Centipede Mountain's head, and then, as Eugene had intended, it continued to fall down through the extremely long body of the demonic beast. Sienna prepared her next spell, but the Centipede Mountains was already dead from Eugene's attack. The moonlight and flames wrapped within the layers of the empty sword tore their way down through the corridor of the deceased Centipede Mountain's body and fell all the way inside the barrier. At that moment, the barrier couldn't help but be weakened. Right then, Sienna stretched both hands forward. Wai-yang. Mana swirled in front of Sienna's hands. Once again, she invoked her absolute decree. What Sienna had desired was simple and irresistible destruction, and her magic brought her wishes to fruition. Boom. A huge wave burst forth from Sienna's hands. The spell that had been created for the sole purpose of destruction swept over the ground, crushing space itself into pieces as it advanced forward. Reinian and Balzac, who were watching all of this take place from behind Sienna, widened their eyes in shock. From their perspective, everything that existed in front of Sienna was suddenly twisted and torn into pieces. It looked as if the world itself was being torn apart by invisible hands. All this happened just as Mare and Rhaenyra reached 9 in their countdown. The Centipede Mountains lost its head, and the raised section of its extremely long body was shattered from inside. Then, as its tough carapace, flesh, and body flew apart in all directions and disintegrated, Eugene leaped back through space, returning to his perch on Rhaenyra's back once more. 10. When Rhaenyra and Mare opened their eyes, Eugene was once again holding the holy sword. Before the two could say anything to express their surprise, Eugene swung the holy sword. As the saint led the priests in a chant, the light surrounding them transformed into a sword that mirrored Eugene's movements. This strike didn't just cut through the barrier like the previous attacks. This time the barrier was finally shattered to the point that it could no longer be repaired. The barrier that had covered all of Horia was overrun by the light and completely destroyed. As for the rest of the body of the Centipede Mountains, which was still enclosing the entire city, after the empty sword that it had swallowed finished wreaking its destruction, Sienna's spell also reached the demonic beast's tough exterior. Immediately, the shockwave of her spell propagated throughout the Centipede Mountain's entire body. Sienna took a brief moment to catch her breath before spreading her arms wide open. Crack. A demonic beast that had been alive for the past 300 years, no, that had been alive for much longer than that. The Centipede Mountains finally met its end as it literally exploded into pieces. First, cracks like spiderwebs spread over its entire body, then it exploded in a loud bang, leaving nothing behind. Aoh! Melkith let out an excited scream at this sight. Melkith had yet to use her infinite force because she felt it was too early for it, but after seeing this scene she couldn't hold back any longer. As she let out another loud cheer, Melkith raised both arms in the air. The spirit summoners of the White Tower of Magic who had been following her immediately acted in response to the shout from their tower master. Magic. Accompanied by an eye-watering flash of light, Melkith's infinite force was fully activated in a combination of flames, earth and lightning. But no, things didn't just end there. The spirit summoners of the White Tower of Magic then called up the various spirits they each controlled and fused them into Melkith's signature. Unite! The spirit summoners all cried out together. This was the White Tower of Magic's supreme spell, Union Force. This was almost too much power for even Melkith to control. It was enough to make her lose her mind. However, with her strong mental power and determination, Melkith managed to wrest control over Union Force's power. Crackle, crack, crackle. Each time the spirit giant's body swelled even larger, it was accompanied by the sound of something cracking within Melkith. No, this wasn't the sound of something cracking. It was the sound of something expanding. No, it can't be. Tempest suddenly let out a cry of great despair as We began to tremble within the cloak of darkness. The intuition that Tempest had been struck with just now also happened to reach Melkith. She realized that her mental limits had expanded past a point that she had once believed was far off from her. Having managed to overcome the limits of what she once thought she was capable of, Melkith cried out with a feeling of ecstatic omnipotence. Come, O storm! Come, spirit king of the wind! Barg! Tempest desperately screamed in refusal but ultimately couldn't disobey the call of being summoned. The body of the towering spirit giant swayed on its feet. At the core of the spell, Melkith stood with her arms held wide open, waiting to meet the soon-arriving storm. Grrr! The storm arrived with a roar. The huge storm soon swept over the spirit giant. Floating in the center of the storm, Melkith gathered her outstretched arms together, embracing the wind blowing towards her. Crackle boom! The storm coalesced in an eye-watering flash of light. Right at that moment, the greatest and most powerful spirit summoner in all history, both past and present, was born. The great spirit summoner who had conquered lightning, earth, flames, and even the wind. This was Melkith Alhaya. She stretched out one hand while feeling a long-awaited ecstasy. Right now, Melkith had managed to reach the perfection that lay at the end of her path as a spirit summoner. Omega Force! Melkith cried out as her new signature was born. Then, without any hesitation, Melkith extended a fist. Her outstretched fist summoned a storm of wind and shot out lightning. When she took a step forward, she caused an earthquake and sparks erupted. So what about the army of undead? Or the demon folk? They are nothing. Melkith mocked. And that was indeed the case. Those gathered here were all high-class demon folk with ranks among the top 50 in all of Helmuth. But even with their subordinates behind them, they were no different than ants to the current Melkith. No matter how many ants were gathered together, ants were still just ants. Melkith stomped on these puny ants as she erupted in loud peals of laughter. That's insane. The other tower masters were also astonished by Melkith's overwhelming majesty. Generic, who had fully grown his Yggdrasil into a colossal tree, was forced to lift up the roots of the tree to avoid the earthquakes caused by Melkith. Lovelian was also shocked as he controlled the demonic beasts pouring out of his pantheon and had to move his demonic beasts elsewhere to avoid Melkith's rampage. Herodis sighed in disbelief. The Blue Tower Master Herodis Yuzlan's signature spell was his Connect. This spell was able to strengthen the wizards of the Blue Tower of Magic while they were connected to Herodis. To put it simply, through this connection he could temporarily raise the level of the wizards from the Blue Tower of Magic. When Herodis cast Connect, the wizards under him could cast spells of a higher circle than they usually could. Herodis' signature was a spell that strengthened the wizards belonging to his Tower of Magic rather than strengthening himself. This was also an incredibly powerful spell in its own right, but when he looked at the current Melkith, it didn't seem all that great. Why have the heavens granted such immense power to a madwoman like the White Tower Master? Herodis sighed once more. Although it went beyond all common sense, Herodis still felt fortunate to have such a powerful spirit summoner as an ally. If Melkith were to ever become an enemy, just how terrible would that be? This was originally a battle in which the allied forces began with an advantage. However, Sienna and Eugene had already destroyed the barrier and killed the Centipede Mountains by exploding it into pieces. Then Melkith had unexpectedly completed her Omega Force. As a result of all these factors, this battle lost all of its variables. As if Sienna's absolute decree had been applied to it, their victory in this battle had already been decided. Let's go. Ivatar roared out. This barren, blackened land around them had been rendered lifeless by dark power. This place was far away from the World Tree and their home forest. However, right now Ivatar and the warriors of the Zoran tribe could sense the presence of the forest in this lifeless desert. It was because of the spirits summoned by Melkith and the other spirit summoners. The vitality brought by the spirits began to infuse this barren, blackened desert with life once more. Thanks to that, the warriors of the Zoran tribe had grown stronger. The various blessings that they possessed made their bodies lighter and amplified their strength. At their head, Ivatar charged forward, wielding an axe in both hands as his warriors followed behind him. Let's go. Alcester shouted. Whether it was Kiel's standard or that of the White Dragon Knights, Alcester couldn't spare any attention for them. All that Alcester could see right now was the battle that lay ahead. Now that the Centipede Mountains had perished in an explosion, the walls of Horia had been revealed. Alcester's steed charged forward, and the White Dragon Knights followed his lead, letting out loud roars. Alcester held his sword up high. It was the Red Dragon, a sword that had been given to Alcester as a gift from Aryartel. A dragon's mana emanated from the sword. It was a considerable amount of mana that seemed almost endless, much more than what Alcester himself possessed. Alcester used the Dragonic family's secret technique, the Empty Sword. The dragon's mana was first converted into sword force and then compressed into layers. Whoosh! A massive empty sword formed over the sword that Alcester was holding over his head. While swinging the dozens of meters long empty sword, Alcester charged toward the city walls. Leading Shimuan's violent Tide Knights, a group of cavaliers all armed with Exid Ordis shouted, "Let's go!" This wasn't the sea and this wasn't a place where any waves should exist. However, Ordis could sense the force of a huge wave washing over this desolate desert. Everyone gathered here was part of a wave moving forward into the new era. I, too, am a part of what is happening here, Ordis thought excitedly. If this were in the past, he wouldn't have gotten hung up on something like this. Originally, the man known as Ordis Hyman was a petty individual whose priorities didn't match his power or status. But that was no longer the case. During the battle against the Demon King, in the midst of all that happened, Ordis had seen the hero. He had learned what a hero truly was and had become fascinated by that radiant young man. So now, Ordis wanted to be a part of the waves that Eugene was creating. That was why Ordis was here. Let's go. Amon-Ra roared. As the snow wolves charged forward, the Beast King Amon opened the way while swinging his great sword. This land was the exact opposite of the snowfields they called home, but that wasn't all that important. Amon was a descendant of the brave Molan. He carried the bloodline of a great warrior, and that blood was currently boiling hot. Amon let out a bestial howl. The brave Molan wasn't able to come here, but Amon knew just how much the brave former king had wanted to take part in this war. That was why the men from Ruhr needed to work even harder. On behalf of their former king who wasn't able to take part, everyone from the kingdom of Ruhr must prove themselves worthy. They had to prove just what kind of country Ruhr truly was and how brave the warriors of that northern country, which had been personally founded by the brave Molan 300 years ago and had remained standing up until now, truly were. Let's go. Ivic shouted as he released the arrow from his bowstring. After shooting his arrow, he immediately stabbed forward with his spear. There were dozens of mercenary companies on this battlefield, and there were so many knights errant that it was impossible to memorize all their names. Ivic, who was in charge of leading them all, prided himself on being a first-class mercenary. But Ivic wasn't the only one who thought that way. The mercenaries that he led, as well as the knights errant, all had high self-esteem and believed themselves to be one of the few who stood at the top of their profession. Those who had managed to reach the top as a mercenary no longer placed earning money as their highest priority. They valued trust, contracts, and honor instead. They didn't come here because they wanted to be paid for their services. No, they came here voluntarily for the sake of honor. But was it really all right to expect them to give their lives for this honor? After all, where in the world would you find someone who was truly not afraid to die? Those who had come here weren't looking for a place to lie down in eternal slumber. The only thing they wanted was victory. They came here to survive, to win, and to gain their honor. Let's go. Raphael shouted as Apollo accelerated forward. Raphael's divine power radiated light all around him. All the demonic beasts flying in the air had been eliminated. The other Pegasus riders also flew forward, still following behind Raphael. The black barrier had been shattered, revealing the city that had been occupied by the Demon King. The shadows had disappeared in the sky around the city, and all that was left was the light. That's right, it was the light. Their God truly had made his presence known, and he was shining his light on the world through the deeds of the hero and his saint. Just look at that sight in front of them. Raphael and the other paladins all had tears in their eyes. Oh, what a brilliant light. The holy sword Altair was shining magnificently. Let's go. Carmen shouted loudly as she clenched her fists. The Pegasi weren't the only ones flying towards the city. The wyverns of the Black Lion Knights had also begun to advance. There weren't any demonic beasts left in the sky for Carmen to beat up. But even so, Carmen clenched her fists and started punching at the sky. For someone trapped inside an egg, the egg was their whole world. In order to be born, they needed to destroy the world they were in. Looking at her appearance in the mirror, Carmen had felt like there was another her trapped in the mirror. Someone who was in a completely opposite reality from her. If she stretched out her fist towards the mirror, her fist would touch the mirror, and at the same time her fist would meet the fist of herself from another reality. Then by going just a bit further she would finally break through. 1. Carmen had once longed for the chance to be reborn. She had longed to have a new life. She had dreamed that she would enter a new world by breaking through the mirror. But all of that was insignificant now. It had all been a misunderstanding on her part. Even without breaking anything, even though she had never been reborn. Carmen grinned. However, now, this wasn't an egg. There wasn't any mirror in front of her. This world was still the same old and shabby world as always. However, after today, once they had won this battle, a new world would open up in front of them. Carmen was sure of that. Let's go. Seal shouted as she followed behind Carmen. It was all far, far too dazzling. She couldn't clearly see what was happening in front of her. Seal had realized it once more. Just how far away Eugene was from her. Just how radiant he truly was. However, that didn't mean she thought of herself as someone shabby in comparison. Because such miserable thoughts wouldn't be of any help in catching up. What Seal needed to do was to keep her eyes fixed on what lay ahead, even if he was so dazzling that she couldn't see him clearly. Let's go. Cyan shouted as he spurred his horse forward. His eyes were on his father's back directly in front of him as Gilead charged ahead of him. Beyond his father's back, Sion could see the city walls gradually getting closer and closer. Lifting his head, Sion looked up at the sky. High in the sky, there was a light so dazzling that it almost made you think that the sun had descended closer to the earth. That was his brother. "Let's go," Gilead roared, already covered in blood. He wasn't injured. All of this blood came from his enemies. Even if Gilead had added up all the blood he had ever seen in his life prior to this day, it would still be less than the blood he had seen since stepping onto this battlefield. His sword, which he had already swung hundreds and thousands of times today, was put away for a few moments. Instead, Gilead raised up a standard. It was the Lionheart standard. This was the banner that Eugene had carried as the flag-bearer when he started this campaign. The banner flapped in the wind as the Lionhearts galloped forward. Their manes fluttering, the lions rushed forward. Gilead raised his head to look up at the sky. The words that everyone was shouting. Their cries were all directed to a single person. Eugene nodded to himself. All right. His wings of black flames were outspread. He could hear all the cries directed towards him from both the earth and the sky. "Let's go," the hero replied to them.